Hi, my name is Erin Riehle, and I am the director and founder of Project Search, and I am delighted to be here working with VCU for this webcast today. My presentation will be talking about jobs in public sector, and I will be talking about how we have had programs in public sector, giving you some examples, and talking about some barriers and some common resolutions, and then ending with some of our strategies to increase the employment of people in public sector. I actually am a nurse by profession, and I have a master's in nursing administration and have worked really all of my life in healthcare. And the truth is that I had no experience in the disability world whatsoever. I didn't have friends who had disabilities. I didn't have coworkers. I think my only exposure had really been to when I saw people with disabilities who might be bagging groceries, or people with disabilities who might work in fast food restaurants cleaning out the tables. And so I think I had really grown up as an American believing that those were the only things that people with disabilities were capable of. And I didn't see them in any other kind of light. And a couple years ago, 13 years ago, I had what I lovingly refer to as my disability epiphany moment, kind of my great wake-up call. And a couple things happened in my life. The first was that I was the director of a very large emergency department, and I had a large number of support positions, which, and they were the type of support positions that could be filled with people who needed short or moderate term on-the-job training. And I found myself constantly hiring the same kinds of folks over and over again, but they weren't necessarily people who honored the work. Most of them were looking at it as a job and not a career, and many of them stayed only 3 to 6 months until they had a better option. And so I was spending a lot in turnover and in training, and the jobs weren't being done well. And at the same time, I had an opportunity to do my budget. And hospitals in America list our revenue by diagnosis. And so I was able to look at the top 10 revenue generators for our hospital by diagnostic category. And what jumped out at me from the paper was that 10 of our top 20 revenue generators at Cincinnati Children's Hospital were directly related to people with disabilities. So here we were a large institution, which on one hand, we talked constantly about valuing diversity. We were serving people with disabilities, and yet we had never really reached out to say that we believed that people with disabilities should also be productively employed members of our own staff. And so 13 years ago, I got together with schools and DRS and MHMR, ESOs, vendors, agency vendors, and we sat down and decided that we would try to create a program that would work within business to allow us to hire people with disabilities. The truth is, we started in healthcare, and that is what I know best. But the reason I'm here today is because since that time, that day 13 years ago, we have now branched out and replicated our program in the public sector all across the country. And we have programs in Vancouver, Washington. We have public sector programs in Leicester, England, in Indianapolis, Indiana, in their county offices. We have programs in Miami, Florida, in their city government. And what we found is that now we're getting more and more calls as public sector folks realize that there's huge potential here. What I want to start off with, I want to talk to you specifically about why hiring people with disabilities has been important to our hospital. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, we're not a hospital. But what I have found is that this slide would probably be more appropriately titled, Why is hiring people with disabilities important to our business? And we found that it's been important across many sectors. Number one, and I already mentioned this, people with chronic illnesses and disabilities are a major source of hospital revenue, and we want to be their provider of choice. When we began hiring people with disabilities, we didn't do it as a charitable or a philanthropic move. We did it because it's smart business. It's the smart thing to do. And we, if we're going to grow as a business, and if our hospital is going to stay viable, then we need to be working with the people who are coming to us. And we figured out and learned a long time ago that in order to attract more people to come to us as patients, we needed to first honor them as people. And one of the biggest ways you can do that is to hire. The second reason, as a business that exists to serve the public, we believe we should reflect the public. And I think this is even more true for government and public sector operations. I think that if, conservative estimates are that 10% of the United States population have disabilities, then we need anywhere in which the public is interacting with a business or public sector to make sure that our workforce reflects the very people we're serving. People with disabilities working in our environment enhance our image, and we receive positive feedback. There was a Gallup poll done 2 Septembers ago by Neil Romano and Phil Sipperstein, and I know VCU has a webcast on which Neil Romano talks about the results, but one of them is really applicable to this situation. And what they found, they polled Americans on their attitudes of people with disabilities working, and they found that 88% of Americans said that if they had the choice between doing business at two like entities, such as a Home Depot and a Lowe's, 88% of them said that they would choose to do business with a company that hired people with disabilities. And it had nothing to do with whether the respondents had a family member or a significant other with a disability. What it had to do with, it boiled down to the impression, the perception, that if a business hires a person with a disability, then they are probably a kinder, gentler, better place for anyone to work and for anyone to do business. In a nutshell, they're perceived to be a more welcoming environment. And we in the healthcare business want to be perceived to be the most welcoming environment possible. And I believe public sector has the same goal. Our employees with disabilities serve as role models for our patients and families and give them a sense of hope. I've told this story many times, but there was a situation once where we had a mom, and she had given birth to a baby with Down syndrome, and the baby and the mom were air flighted into our hospital for surgery. And the mom wrote our president a letter, president of the hospital, and said, here I was sitting in this room, and I was sobbing, and I felt like, my world, the floor had just dropped out of my world and didn't know where to turn next. And she said, the next thing that happened changed my life, and that is that a young woman with Down syndrome walked into the room, took a look at my baby, and said, what a cute baby, and then proceeded to stock every single supply in that room. And the mom said, that moment changed my life, because I knew right then and there that my child could grow up to be a productively employed citizen and give back. And that is what she had been feeling would be impossible. Our recruitment of talent is positively impacted. In the last 5 years, we have hired a new chief of staff, a new chief surgeon, a new head of our cardiovascular research department, and a new head of our Down syndrome clinic. All 4 of those men were heavily recruited from across the world, actually, and all 4 of them wanted to meet with me. And the reason they wanted to meet with me wasn't because I'm special. The reason they wanted to meet with me was that all 4 men had young adult children with disabilities. And as part of their recruitment decision, they wanted to be in a community that they knew would honor their young adult children and provide opportunities. And so even as, it even goes to being perceived as a welcoming environment, a welcoming community. Universal design helps all employees. You probably most all of you know what that means, but universal design is simply that body of knowledge that says that whenever we put something in place for a person with a disability, it is likely to help everyone in that environment, disability or not. We certainly have seen that at Children's Hospital. Employment's the #1 priority of young adults, not health care, and belief in a productive future increases compliance. We have seen our costs go down. Productivity-wise, our productivity has gone up, which has decreased our cost. But it's been because we've begun to say to every person we work with, we believe you will grow up. and be productively employed. You must do your part to be compliant in healthcare. People with chronic illnesses and disabilities represent the fastest growing market segment in the United States. In 2007, it was estimated that they control $1 trillion in aggregate spending. If you add their significant others, it's about $3 trillion. As a hospital, we have decided that we cannot afford to dismiss that kind of financial power. If we do so, we do so at our own peril. And we believe that we need to work with those folks and show that we value them, not just because they bring money, but because we believe they have much to offer to our hospital. And I think when I think about our programs in public sector, the same is true. For every person with a disability who's employed, they're paying taxes. They bring a welcomingness to the environment that isn't necessarily there before. In our case, as a business, families with relatives with disabilities have increased their gifts to our programs. We've experienced increased local, regional, and national recognition. And maybe most importantly, performance and retention in some of our high turnover positions has increased dramatically. As I mentioned, we started out in healthcare, but we now have programs in public sector across the country, and actually, across the world. And I wanted to just go over a few of the specific benefits to the public sector that we've seen to date. Number one, employing people with disabilities fits within a city or county's stated goal of a diversified workforce. You really can't count a workforce as being diverse unless you're also reaching out to a population that is mirrored by 10% of the people living in your community. And if you want to be a welcoming environment where everyone feels like they're welcome at the table and welcome to come in for services, then you must include people with disabilities. The second one is availability of job training and long-term support. What we have found is in public sector is that when we've hired people with disabilities, as a business, there is support in the community, so there's no need to go down this path alone. There are many agencies and ESOs and vendors and schools that are there to support you as you begin to employ people with disabilities. Employing people with disabilities offers public sector the potential for increased coworker stability. We have certainly seen our tenure increase dramatically in departments where we had rapid turnover before. We also have seen our absenteeism go down across the board in those departments where we've hired people with disabilities. And I'll just give you a really good example. It's really hard for a coworker to call in and say, well, I can't get to work today because I can't get out of my driveway because there's a little bit of snow, and then find out that a person with a disability who needed to take public transportation to get to work made it in on the same day. And I just think it changes attitudes, minds and attitudes of coworkers. As I mentioned before, hiring people with disabilities definitely increases the welcoming factor, and I believe that is key in the public sector. And the last benefit is that the pre-screening that can be done by partners that you work with in the rehab community is a huge time-saving benefit to organizations that are out there. Now, what are we seeing as some of the common barriers? Again, when we've worked with public sector, many things come up, and the barriers tend to be the same in most areas. One is that in public sector, there's typically a competitive hiring process, and that may involve testing. It may involve some experience or education requirements. And what we have done to try to resolve that is really, we've sat down with the decision makers, with the decision enforcers, administrators, HR, and with the people who are doing the work, and said, okay, we know that there are competitive hiring processes. How do we work with you to also ensure that those competitive hiring processes aren't serving as blocks to your ability to hire people with disabilities? And what we found is some solutions is that there are cases where a person with a disability can be brought on and allowed to perform the job for a trial period, say 6 to 9 months. And that job trial can actually serve as the test. Something else that you can do, you can develop a transition program with a local high school and bring students in at no cost to the institution. It's a win-win for everybody. And allow them to go through internships in your departments so that they learn skills. And you also get to see them as people and see what they're capable of, and then have an opportunity to hire those who are qualified. And lastly, in terms of this one, you can, one of the solutions for this barrier is that you can teach components of the test during the year. You know, the other thing we hear about as a barrier is job classifications. And some of the things we've done related to that, to solving that, are to restructure some job duties, to reclassify when possible to actual performance, and to create new job classes. And then there's unions. And I probably need to say by default that I am actually a card-carrying member of the AFL-CIO. I drove a forklift for many years in my life, and I believe that unions, for the most part, are incredibly supportive of hiring people with disabilities as long as they're involved from day one. And what we have found is that people with disabilities are eager to pay dues. They're eager to follow the rules. They're eager to be part of a system and are incredibly valuable as union members. So again, we recommend including the union rep in planning from day one about employment of people with disabilities. We also include supported employment positions in collective bargaining agreements in some places in the country. One thing that we do in public sector is that we have tried to stay away from what those perceived easy jobs. Not that it's not honorable work, because it is. It's incredibly honorable work to bag groceries and to work in fast food, and many people want that. The problem is that when 60% of any population, such as people with developmental disabilities, are found only in those areas, that is statistically impossible. And what it says is that we're placing them there rather than it being about their choice. And so what our project has done in public sector and in healthcare is tried to show that people with disabilities are capable of doing incredibly complex and systematic work, complex and routine work, and that public sector, healthcare, insurance, big business, they are full of positions that are complex and systematic. This is a very unscientific slide. I have no data to back it up, but it's kind of my perception of how people with disabilities might learn just a little bit differently on occasion. Many people without disabilities and some people with disabilities learn according to a very standard model. So they learn their jobs quickly and they follow the bell curve. And they don't need anything different than perhaps a regular orientation. But some people with disabilities, and in fact some people without disabilities, don't learn in that same fashion. And all we've been able to do is say, if we put in place a program that acknowledges these people with disabilities can probably get to the same exact place of performance, it's just that their path may look different. So they may have to learn a few skills and then practice them, and then learn a few more and then practice those. And I think the whole point is we have learned in our organization that there are different paths to learning or education. And just because a person with a disability may take a different path doesn't mean that it's a bad path. It just means it's a different path. And often the outcome in performance is exactly the same. What I want to do now, and again, I know healthcare best, so I'm going to start off by discussing some of those jobs. I think that one of my biggest challenges when I work and when I talk with people is that, and I think this is pretty normal, and I certainly have done it myself, I think we tend to think that the job we are doing is so incredibly important that no one else could do it, or that it would be difficult for someone else to do it. And that is particularly apparent when it comes to talking about people with disabilities. You know, we look at our jobs and we think, well, gosh, my job is so critical that there's no way a person with a disability could do that. And I have to tell you, I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't agree with it based on what I've learned over the past few years. And hopefully, these next few stories I share with you from our hospital will really make it clear to you that people with disabilities can do many jobs, including some of the jobs that are most critical to our operation. So I'm just going to tell some stories, and I do have permission to mention their names and their diagnosis and some other relevant information. But this is a young woman by the name of Annie Sublett, and Annie has Down syndrome. And Annie was the first person with a disability I ever hired. And she worked with me in the emergency department where she stocked supplies. And she was our stocking technician, and she was responsible for 58 rooms. And Annie was probably the best stocker I had ever had. That's S-T-O-C-K-E-R. And Annie did a great job. She came to work every day. If I asked her to count items, she did it. If I asked her to rotate stocks, she did it. If I asked her to check dates, she did it. And things were going really, really well. And about 6 months after I hired Annie, the head of the dental clinic came to me and said, you know, we need a person to sterilize our dental instruments. Do you think there's a chance that Annie Sublett could do that? We know you've had her. We know she's come to work, done a super job. We'd like to try her out. Well, I think I did what most people without disabilities do. And I didn't even bother to call Annie and ask her if she was interested in trying it. I didn't call her family. I just decided that it would be okay for me to make a decision on Annie's behalf. And in this case, unfortunately, I made the decision to fail on her behalf. And I'll show you why. She had worked with me in the emergency department for 6 months, and she was our best stalker. But when I was asked about a transfer, or her moving to the dental clinic, all I could remember was that she couldn't find her locker in our locker room, and she didn't know how to open the combination lock. And so instead of looking at everything she could do well, I looked at the two things she couldn't do, and I extrapolated her whole performance based on those two things. Now, fortunately, I went home, I thought about it, and I thought, you know, I really don't think Annie can do this, but at the same time, I don't know. And the one thing I am certain of is that in my life, I have been given my own opportunities to both succeed or fail. No one has ever done it for me. And so I decided at that moment in time that I would make sure that every person with a disability got the same opportunity I had. And this next slide is a picture of Annie Sublett today. 13 years later, she has worked for 13 years in our dental clinic. We have a 15-room dental clinic. The cases turn over every 30 minutes, and Annie Sublett is the only person who sterilizes and processes every dental instrument that we put into a person's mouth at our hospital. And I don't know about you, I hope what you understand about this is that it's an incredibly critical job. You can't put a dirty instrument into someone's mouth. It's life-threatening. And here you have a person with a significant disability who's doing this job better than anyone ever has before, and has stayed in this job almost 5 times longer than anyone ever had before. And you know what? This is all it took for her to be able to open her locker. Nothing more than a laser lock. You aim the little laser at the laser in the lock, and it pops open. And it's funny because if you walked into this locker room today where Annie works, you'd see about a half dozen of these. And it's not because we have a half dozen people with disabilities working there. It's because for many of us, we have a difficult time opening our combination lock. So Annie isn't that different from any of us. And what we put in place to help her resolve this issue helped many people in the department. My next slide, this is Heidi Hams. When Heidi started working with us, she wanted to work with babies. And we didn't have any positions working in the nursery at the time. But we do have a 55-bed neonatal intensive care unit. And we have a huge fleet of isolates and incubators. And those isolates and incubators have to be carefully sterilized and processed, because you can't put a preemie in a piece of equipment that is dirty or does not meet quality assurance measures. And Heidi was very interested in doing this job. And what's fascinating about it to me is that this is the way she learned her job. Nothing more than a series of pictures that our partner agency put on the wall and used to train her. And I should tell you that every isolette has more than 44 removable parts. She has to take them apart, sterilize them, put them back together again. She checks the filter, the water level, the electrical circuitry, and the health and safety tag. She's the only person responsible for these. She actually was hired by our hospital by Sodexo Marriott, and they approached us several years ago and said, you know what, Heidi is better at this job than anyone we know, could we begin to use her as a national trainer? And so this slide shows you a man who had been newly hired by Sodexo Marriott in Chicago. He had flown in for the day to work with Heidi just to learn how to take care of isolates and incubators. And the sign says, "Congratulations and thank you to Heidi Hams for training your 200th manager." Oximetry probes. You know, this is not that special a job, but it's a job we couldn't fill because no one was interested in it. And each patient is given an oximetry probe. They cost us $18 new, but they can be recycled twice, and we only have to pay $6 each time. But we were throwing them away because it was a tedious process that had many steps. First of all, you had to wipe it down with a sterilizing agent. You had to check the color of the tag to make sure it hadn't already been recycled too many times. You had to check the head of the probe to make sure it wasn't broken. And you could only put 40 in one given bag when you sent it back to the manufacturer. And we could not find anyone who wanted to do this job. And then we hired Nick. The thing is, Nick cannot count to 40. And he also can only use one of his arms. And now, in past, I would have looked at this and said, well, how can Nick do it if he can't count to 40, and that's one of the job requirements? But what I have learned is that there's many ways to figure things out. And our partners created for us this Lazy Susan, or this standing jig. It's made out of plywood. It's a piece of plywood on top that rotates, and into that they cut 40 slots. And so once Nick fills every slot, he doesn't have to count because they're automatically 40. And because they're hanging, he can pull his chair up underneath and use his stronger arm to wipe it down. And at the end of this past fiscal year on June 30th, our hospital had saved $1.1 million by recycling oximetry probes in a job that we couldn't get anyone else to take. Jill Frambies. Jill has worked for us for about 12 years, and she works in our clinical sterilization department. Now, I don't know how many of you have had surgery, probably a lot. But when you go into OR, you have what's called an OR case kit, and that's where they keep all of the instruments. Jill Frambies at our hospital is one of the people who processes and sterilizes every case kit. Now, the particular kit you see on this page has 152 instruments. It's a laparotomy tray. It's used to do abdominal surgery. This tray has just come out of a pressure washer. Jill is going to dump that out, and she's going to put those instruments back into a case kit in the exact order that they will be used by the surgeon, from last instrument to first. And she has to even know if the tray is going to be a left-handed or a right-handed tray, because then she has to start them from the opposite sides. She's been doing this for 9 years, and in that time she's made one error. And every step of this process is barcoded, and she has to swipe her badge against the barcode so that we can look at the quality assurance for every step. This is what the pick list that they used to train people used to look like. This is how it was modified by our partners to allow us to teach Jill. This is Jill today. It's actually a totally staged picture. She hasn't used a book in years. But I wanted you to see that she has exactly the same work area that anybody else in that department does. She wears exactly the same uniform. She comes to work at exactly the same time. Now, what's remarkable to me about this is this department has a productivity number of 25 trays. So they expect every employee who works here to complete 25 trays a day. Jill has decided that she would like the number of trays she produces a day to match her age in a given year. She's 32 this year, so Jill is now doing 32 trays. Marty Eckes. Marty has spastic cerebral palsy. Her speech is unintelligible. She needed a very, very few accommodations and adaptations. But she has a degree in IT. No one had ever given her a chance. We hired her, and she now audits our nursing documentation, our online documentation, from which we do billing and our accreditation surveys. This is Marty at home. One of the things we do is we allow her to work from home once a week, and she's with her helping dog there. She also uses a Dynavox, which is a device that helps her communicate. And we have found that it doesn't matter how you communicate, whether you use a a computer, a Dynavox, an alphabet board, a telephone, you sign. It's not nearly so important how you accomplish it as that you have some way of communicating, and we've been able to adapt to any one of those ways. This is a young man by the name of Demetrius. Demetrius is in a very large wheelchair, and he does our patient billing when it comes to materials supply. This young man, Tim Erdman, Tim has cerebral palsy. Tim is one of our ICD-9 coders. What that means is he is going through charts, and he is doing coding, which we use to then bill. It's how we collect all of our revenue. And he is one of our coders. And you can see in this picture that he uses a key guard overlay. Well, that was him 12 years ago. This is him today. He's 12 years older. He no longer needs a key guard overlay, but he's having some difficulty with his vision. But our partners stepped in seamlessly and said, okay, how can we help you with a CCTV and to make sure that we have some accommodations that helped him with his vision. We have folks who use one-handed keyboards because they've had a stroke. This young man worked at Fifth Third Bank, the man on the right in the green shirt, and he has severe autism. Had a very difficult time getting employed because he had some behaviors that are fairly typical for autism. And we brought him into our program at Fifth Third Bank because he's very good with a 9 key. And we put him in the mortgage department where he entered thousands of 12-digit mortgage numbers each day. And we did that on a trial basis. And on the third day that he was doing it, he actually went to the manager and said, you know, but he said, I've entered a number today that I entered on Monday. And the manager kind of laughed at him, you know, and said, well, that's not possible. You know, we've had this program for years. And the young man continued to get a little more agitated. So finally the manager, really just to kind of end it all, decided he would go back and check. And in fact, it was true. He had entered a number on Wednesday that he had already entered on Monday. And they went back and found a huge computer glitch that had cost them tens of thousands of dollars that they never would have known about. He caught that on a Wednesday, and that evening he was offered a job. This young woman has Down syndrome. She's in a huge filing room at Fifth Third Bank. It's about the size of 2 football fields. She has to meet the same production quota, which is 300 files a day, and the same accuracy quota, 98%, as any other employee in that department. And she is surpassing that as an employee. I'm going to stop here just a minute and say, and I know those are all positions, and you're probably saying, well, you know, we're public sector. What I hope that you see, though, is that every one of those jobs is critical. And every one of those jobs has to be done, and done in an exact fashion. And there is no room for error. So as opposed to sitting back and saying, oh, our work is so important and so critical, we couldn't hire a person with a disability, we have learned that just the opposite is true. If we have a job that is critical, if we have a job where we need sterling performance over and over and over again, we have found that it's often the case that a person with a disability is our best choice for that position. And the same goes for public sector. What I want to run through next are some examples from our public sector programs across the country. This is a young woman who has spina bifida. She now works as a clerical assistant in city government. This young man has autism. He works in Miami doing document prep for scanning. This young man works in Seattle, Washington on the grounds maintenance crew for the county parks. These 2 men actually work in the county print shop, and they also work in mailing. And you can see the man on the right in the brown and white striped shirt. He does not tolerate noise well, and that's a distraction for him. So what he wears every day are a pair of headphones that allow him to stay focused and targeted while he's at work. That's all it took. This young man loved cars, loved everything about automobiles, and found a job as cleaning out the buses and washing the buses for the Washington State Transit System. This young woman with a significant developmental disability became a file clerk in juvenile justice. Now, I don't know about you, but you don't put someone that you're worried about or that you don't trust into a department where you're filing files related to juvenile justice or any other type of filing for that matter. And this is where she works. She doesn't make mistakes. She comes to work every day, and she's doing a critical job. I know that we have a number of people who work in our HR department, and I have folks all the time ask me, well, aren't you worried that they're going to misfile something or share confidential information? And actually, just the opposite is true. What I find is it's people like myself who care more about whether someone is on a warning or being disciplined, or care to, we want to know what someone else is making in comparison to ourselves. And when we have placed people in HR departments, we don't find that same behavior. They're incredibly confidential and aren't looking through files. We do have folks who work in the cafe as cafe attendants out in Seattle. But again, we don't think everybody with a disability has to work there. They work there if it's what they want to do. This young woman works in the city finance office as an aide. This young man services all of the county vehicles. He does the lubing, and he's a facilities maintenance worker. Again, I talked about this a little bit, human resources. There are many jobs in human resources that can capably be done by people with disabilities. The same here. We have people who work in mailing departments, mailing depots, in very large institutions. The man on the left in this picture is deaf, and what he does, he works in a system, and he is their AV person, and he goes around to all of the rooms. He does conference setup, and he sets up the websites, the projectors, the computers, everything needed for any of their conference facility. And the young woman on the right serves as a main receptionist in a large public building. I think what I've found, and what I hope you've seen, is that there are many, many jobs in public sector that could be capably filled by people with disabilities. And in fact, probably more than capably. They might surpass performance of some other people we've had employed. And the only thing that prevents this from happening sometimes are rules that we need to revisit and look at their fairness. But perhaps the biggest barrier is actually low expectancy. And Mark Gold said this in 1975. He said, low expectancy on the part of society is the single most critical deterrent to programs for people with severe disabilities. And I've certainly found that to be the case. But what I have learned is that there's no reason for us to have low expectancy. We should mirror what the public looks like. We should be including people with disabilities in every aspect of our business, especially when we are a business that works to serve the public. We should have people in our midst who look like the people we're serving, so that everybody who comes through the door knows that they are welcome there, and that they're a part of who we are, and that we actually know what's important to them instead of guessing about what's important to them. I just want to end with a few of the things that we have done to increase public sector employment. And I think one of the things is we've worked on education. We've done staff meetings. We've done brown bag lunches. We've gone into department meetings and talked about what is it like to supervise an employee with disability? What might you have to do differently than you've done before? What don't you have to do? We've given some disability-specific information. If you're getting ready to hire someone with autism, what might be some of the things that come up? How do you manage the environment and the employee and the peer relationships? So we do a lot of education. There is a great video out there. It's called The 10 Commandments of Communicating with People with Disabilities. And it's about $200. You can get it online. And we show that all the time. It takes about 20 minutes. We show the video. That leaves us 10 minutes for discussion. It's a great icebreaker at staff meetings. And it changes your comfort level so that you can ask questions that maybe you find difficult otherwise. So we do lots of education for staff and training. We also set up internship programs. it's very, very common for government and public sector locations and hospitals and banks to be running training programs for all kinds of people. And the next step beyond that, really, is just to put in place a training program for people with disabilities. That's exactly what we did. We allowed interns to come in and learn skills in a real environment where they are rarely welcomed, and they rarely have the opportunity to learn skills. And that's the only way we can change culture and teach them the skills that they can take out into the community. We also, out west, are looking at how we might look at some jobs in terms of apprenticeships. You know, are there ways for us to get into plant manufacturing and landscaping and electrical and all of those departments in public sector through an apprenticeship type training? The last thing I would say is that there is a group out in Washington called O'Neill and Associates, and I think they're doing the best public sector work of anybody I've seen in the United States. If I know my information is going to be included in this presentation, but if you'd ever like to speak to anyone from O'Neill and Associates and you want to email me, I would be more than happy to get back to you with that information. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great day. And what I really hope is that for those of you in public sector, I hope that one day you have the joy in life that it really is to employ a person with a disability. And so I thank you. I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.